I'd like to reflect for a few minutes on this presentation of some of the dilemmas we encounter in contemplative interfaith dialogue. Certainly one of the more pressing issues of our time, not a particularly new issue. When Christianity emerged in the late antique world, it was a very pluralist world, full of syncretism, a whole variety of different religions. And so when we're sometimes encouraged to think that somehow this is a new era or on cusp of history in which we've never faced, sometimes called the axial age. This just is not true. In fact, early Christianity emerged in a period of time of immense syncretism and pluralism. And so we can, in that sense, draw from the well of the past, the wisdom of the past, the women and men of the past who had reflected on what's the relationship of Christianity to other religions. This is probably the foundation or the core question, really, of Christianity. Christianity rises and falls in who your view of Christ is. And so there's a whole movement today that argues that he's no different than, saying that from the Jewish tradition, great prophet, a great rabbi. So the whole Jewish-Christian interfaith dialogue hinges on how do the Jews see Christ. And many of them are willing to take a more positive view as long as he's seen as a prophet, a rabbi, a sage, a wise person, particularly a political reformer, a softer version of the zealots in that sense. Within Islam itself, Jesus is seen, and they quickly acknowledge Jesus as a prophet, standing in the line and lineage of Abraham, Jesus, Muhammad. And so in that sense, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they're all willing to, if seen from a certain perspective, see Jesus as human, all too human, but a very significant religious, moral thinker, mystic, in line with the Sufis within Islam. Within Hinduism, he can certainly be seen as an avatar, and then we can ask the question, what's the relationship between incarnation and avatar? Within Buddhism, the whole notion of the bodhisattva, the one who has achieved enlightenment, like the arhat, but does not go over, comes back to serve, to care. Is Jesus just a bodhisattva in the Buddhist sense of the term? So the big question is within certainly interfaith dialogue, what is your view of Christ in relationship to the founders of other religions? If he is seen, as I mentioned, just as a bodhisattva, an avatar, a prophet, a wise rabbi, then in that sense, Christianity is no different than any other religions of the world. It is just a way in comparison to other particular religious traditions, spiritual traditions, means of transformations. In 1997, I belong to the Diocese of New West, Anglicanism. Our bishop in this particular diocese published a book called Mansions of the Spirit, Bishop Michael Ingham. And in that particular book, he addressed this problem, recognizing very clearly we live in what Marshall McLuhan says, a global village. The world has shrunk to the level of people from different religious traditions or no religious traditions interacting at a regular level. And so we don't live in a sort of a splendid isolation anymore, not that we ever really did in one sense, but it's certainly more obvious now that we don't. We encounter people of all faiths and no faiths at a regular way. So what then is the relationship of Christianity to these religious traditions or to secularism itself? And is Jesus just one amongst many historic wise people, prophets? And if so, then what makes Christianity unique or special in any way at all? Now, Bishop Michael Ingham's position, we have a couple of nasty words in our culture. We're not supposed to be, for the word one way, exclusive. Exclusive is one of those words that is often seen in a derogatory way. And Bishop Michael Ingham, drawing from certainly a much bigger discussion in this interfaith issue, looks at four particular models of interfaith thinking. One is the exclusive, one is the inclusive, one is the pluralist, and then one is the syncretist tradition in terms of making sense of how these religions are to interact, if they are to interact. The exclusive position is sometimes framed in a way, perhaps inappropriately so, and yet understandably so, that my religion is the true one, and that can be Judaism in comparison to Christianity, Christianity in comparison to Judaism, Islam in comparison to Christianity and Judaism is the fulfillment of these two particular traditions. Elements of Hinduism can see itself as superior to Buddhism, Buddhism to Hinduism, Taoism to Confucianism. Depending on where a person stands within a tradition, there's the notion that somehow mine is a little truer and it excludes others. Now, in the one version of the exclusive tradition is that we're right and you're wrong. So it's an either-or perspective, and that's probably the crudest form of exclusivism. And you'll get a lot of people in different traditions. You can find them in that crude exclusivism. We're going to revisit exclusivism a little later, look at the subtler and more nuanced notion of exclusivism. The inclusive position still takes the position that excludes, but it says other traditions have valuable areas of insight. There's wisdom, there's prophetic insights, and so one religion is truer, but the other particular tradition also has great insight. So it's necessary but not sufficient in terms of the fullness of an understanding of the great eternal truths. You'll find the inclusive position in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. You'll find them in most traditions in which other traditions or other traditions within their own tradition are at a lower level, but they still have significant elements of truth. But the highest truths, say in Hinduism, if you're coming from monistic Shankara tradition or reading the Upanishads, that position is going to argue there's lower levels of personalist religion, but you have to transcend those particular perspectives. For example, Islam will say, yes, there are truths in Judaism and Christianity, but in Islam, or Muhammad's insight, he's the seal of the prophets, and so in that sense. So it's not an either-or perspective within the inclusive position. It sees the lower levels of religious insight as leading into the higher levels of which a particular religion is seen as the highest level. Important to note that even the inclusive position is exclusive, because it excludes the lower levels from being the higher levels of truth. And this is important to understand when we revisit this notion of exclusivism. The third model, which is very trendy today, certainly in a liberal tradition, is the pluralist tradition, in which each religion in its own way has particular insights of truth. None are any truer than another. They're just different ways in trying to make sense of, unpack the faith journey, the spiritual journey, the contemplative journey. So no particular religion per se has the right to say my particular heritage, the ethos from which my particular tradition was birthed, is any truer than another. So pluralism itself, and this is important to get, is exclusive. It excludes any other religion from making ultimate truth claims, because pluralism becomes the ultimate interpretation itself. There are different types of syncretism, which would be the fourth model Michael Ingham brings up. There are crude forms of syncretism, and again, there are sophisticated forms of syncretism. Michael Ingham in Mansions of the Spirit looks at particularly more sophisticated versions of syncretism, which I was trained in doing my second MA. Person I studied under was probably one of the leading people in terms of bringing the leading people of the primordial tradition, Fritjof Schuon, Rennie Guan, Kumaraswamy. Houston Smith often came to University of British Columbia when I was there, and sometimes Thomas Merton is seen as a part of that. He isn't, and I'm going to refer to some of his quotes later, where he's far more nuanced and subtle in this. The crudest version of syncretism would be sort of the Baha'i tradition, in which they're trying to develop a world religion. I mean, they'll often argue all the religious wars of the past, and usually a certain element of them justified, supported through religion. If we can overcome that through one great religion, in which Baha'u'llah in the 19th century saw himself as synthesizing the best of the Western traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and then the best of the Eastern traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and other religions itself. That's an attempt explicitly in time to create one great unified religion. Important to recognize within the Baha'i tradition, it is exclusive. It excludes the truth claims of other religions, and it basically argues that it is the one that is the great synthesis of all religions. Now, the form of syncretism Bishop Michael Ingham deals with in Mansions of the Spirit, and from which Jim Packer and I responded in 1998. It's a little booklet called In a Pluralist World, and it's been republished just this year by Lexham Press, called Christianity and Pluralism. What I address in that, and I wish I'd developed it a little further, is that within the primordial tradition itself, they argue, and they're a little more nuanced than Baha'i, they argue that at the exoteric level of all religions, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, Sikh tradition, for example, these are different ways of coming to the ultimate. So it's very important that people stay within a tradition at the exoteric level. But as people move further through their own exoteric with the disciplines, with the liturgies, with the myths, the theology, the philosophy, and each of these exoteric traditions, they're all valid ways, but they don't come together themselves, because you can't bring them together, so they do exclude one another. But the mystics within each of the religions, or the contemplatives within each of the traditions, as they move from the exoteric to the esoteric level, there is a convergence, there is a unity. So, for example, the Hasidic traditions, or the Kabbalistic traditions within Judaism, the mystical traditions within Christianity, the Sufi traditions within Islam, within Hinduism itself, the Upanishads and Shankara and some of the leading Advaita philosophers, they lead to a great mystical unity within monism itself. Buddhism itself, there's a belief as you move beyond, where of course Buddha was silent in terms of what is ultimately there. Some of the great mystics of the Amida tradition of Buddhism and others, they would argue there's this upward swing to a greater unity. You get this in elements of Taoism as well. So in the primordial tradition, the argument is that in fact at an exoteric level, and where Baha'i tries to synthesize the primordial traditions, is you cannot bring these traditions together. Only the mystics within each tradition come to a point of unity or convergence in that sense. Now, one of the questions I ask in my book, both in a Pluralist World, because I did most of my work, a couple of MAs and much of my PhD on, in fact, the mystic traditions in all world religions, is do the mystics, do the contemplatives converge? Is there concord at the highest level of religions, both within each religion and between religions itself? And most of my work came to the conclusion that no, they don't, in fact. Both within Judaism, within Christianity, you have tensions between contemplatives. Within the Sufi tradition, Islam, there's totally different interpretations of theology, experience, and many other things. The same thing you'll get in, say, Hinduism between Ramanuja, for example, or Shankar, and how they interpret the Upanishads. Within Buddhism itself, you get important divergences. And so the argument from the primordial traditions is that the exoteric level, there's divergence. At the esoteric level, there's unity. So even within syncretism, we're dealing with exclusivism. And this is important to recognize, that in a culture in which as I said, we want a sort of an inclusiveness, and out of that comes tolerance. Well, it's easy to be tolerant if nobody's right or wrong. Meaningful tolerance only begins when people recognize they have differences at a core level, but they respect and honor one another as human beings. And so these four models, the exclusive, the inclusive, the pluralist, and the syncretist, they all, at the end of the day, and it's important to recognize, they're all exclusive. And so that's only when people start and recognize that clearly can meaningful contemplative interfaith dialogue, where you realize at core these are quite different. I'd like to just read a quote. Thomas Merton, as he was coming near the end of his life, gave a lecture at the Temple of Understanding in Calcutta in 1968. Actually, he didn't read from his paper, he did an earlier one, but his actually paper is very, very good on this issue. He says, without asserting that there is complete unity of all religions at the top, the transcendent or mystical level, they all start from different dogmatic positions to meet at the summit. It's certainly true to say that even where there are irreconcilable differences in doctrine and formulated belief, there may still be great similarities and analogies in the realm of religious experience. He then goes on to say cultural and doctrinal differences must remain, but they do not invalidate a very real quality of existential likeness. So Merton is grappling with the issue, on the one hand, recognizing very clearly that there is a tendency in our time to want a too easy syncretism, a too easy unity, a too easy convergence. He finishes this particular lecture by saying, There can be no question of a facile syncretism, a mishmash of semi-religious verbiage and pieties, a devotionalism that admits everything and therefore takes nothing with full seriousness. And so when we think of then interfaith dialogue or contemplative dialogue, there are serious questions that have to be pondered. My little booklet, Christianity and Pluralism, also raises the question of it's one thing to be engaged in this at a contemplative interfaith way in which conferences are held, retreat centers are held. You'll have teachers who are come in, are well trained in the disciplined practices of the contemplative way. But what's the relationship of this to the political issues where there's tragedy and suffering and injustice and war and environmental issues? Sometimes the interfaith dialogue takes place high above the actual struggles in the valley itself. So there's a real need when people are grappling with the contemplative to ask, what's the relationship of contemplative interfaith dialogue and prophetic political action? Because if in fact the contemplative is just as it were on the mountain peak and not dealing with the valley, it itself can become an opiate in some ways. And so the bringing together of the prophetic and the contemplative is absolutely essential as we move forward in this global village that we live in. Sometimes the prophetic excludes the contemplative, which is not healthy. Then you get a frantic drivenness, a frantic activism, a frantic preaching from the rooftops, moral grandstanding that can slip into a bit theatrical activism at times. It's how you bring together a thoughtful interfaith perspective and also a meaningful prophetic engagement. It's the bringing together to those without saying that different traditions are all saying the same thing. That feeds into the trendiness of our culture, but it also distorts the substance of other religions. And the way forward is a way in which each of these great major and minor traditions can stay true to their core, recognizing they're in different recognizing they're not all going to the same place in their understanding. They have a very different message, which is why the religions continue, but still respect between members of these traditions, learning, heeding, because all traditions obviously can always be learning from one another, because each religion is prone to distortion. That's the very nature of any time humans interpret and then live forth, and this is why other great traditions are essential. And for that matter, secularism itself is a critique. In fact, Merton's final lecture before he died was on Marxism and monasticism. What could he learn? What could Christians learn from the best of Marxist thought without uncritically buying into Marxist ideology? And so these bigger issues, and so a person needs a nimble, a subtle, a listening, and attentive mind and soul and heart to engage in these issues. So the little book, the earlier book Jim Packer and I did in 1998, which was responding to Bishop Michael Ingham's Mansions of the Spirit, tries to address these four models, looking how at the end of the day they are all exclusive, some crudely so, some subtly so. But best to recognize at the forefront that somehow inclusivism or pluralism or syncretism is more open-minded than the exclusive position, because all of these are exclusive at the end of the day, and they set themselves up as the absolute. And then the recent publication, Christianity and Pluralism, which just recently came out, is just the updating in some ways of the earlier In a Pluralist World, in which we look at these particular four models.